Prehistoric Planet and its new second season is probably together the best paleontology documentary made in many aspects. From the designs of the animals to the science behind it and the behaviors being shown, it really has a lot that you can commend. However, there's also some issues with it that I think they could be able to address if they do make a third season, and I'm pretty sure they will based on one single piece of evidence that I think is pretty convincing. I'll get to that later though. First, let's actually look at the series and what it did do well and some of the things that were a little bit weaker. A lot of this is going to revolve around the second season because it A, was able to take lessons learned from the first season, but B, they've already mentioned about the production that a lot of the sequences in the second season were just cut from the first season, and sometimes that shows. For example, there's a sequence in the second season where they go down to Antarctica and the dinosaur Imperator is hunting Morosaurus and they run across this ice sheet. We already saw this with the Dromaeosaurs and the Nodiosaurs hunting in the first season. They're hunting through snow. It's very straightforward and again, we've seen it. Meanwhile, the Imperator sequence is placed into the Islands episode when there's nothing about it that makes it actually feel distinctly like an island. It's kind of just a, well, where do we throw this part? Just throw it in the Islands episode, that's fine. Meanwhile, other parts of the Islands episode did incredibly well. For example, it starts with this Almoxes, which is great because it's floating on this little raft of plant material and there's a mosasaur underneath it that they very much say would eat this Almoxes. It's showing how these different environments of the land and the water are interacting, and how even over time, you can still have animals that are going to be stuck on some of these rafts and drifting to other islands, potentially being able to make new species. It's showing these more complex and even potentially leading to longer conclusions for the future. The same episode does this even better when they're looking at Madagascar, because it shows a lot of the diversity in Madagascar. It was an island and it's still an island. It's a very large island. But that does mean the life that's there today is pretty unique, and even in the past it was. For example, with Simosuchus, which we did a video on. It's this really unique animal. The Jungosaurus is also pretty unique, and Adalatherium and Machikosaurus are also still unique. I know I keep repeating this, but it's just showing how well this environment actually is able to become integrated with all of these different organisms interacting in the same place. It's really nice to see, and I think that them doing this longer sequence focused on one location is what really helped that sequence come together as probably one of the best of the series. But that kind of integration that we see with the environment and the various organisms living within it is incredibly well done in this second season. For example, you have the Velociraptors waiting for the Tarbosaurus to start the hunt to scare the Prenocephalae up the cliffs and be able to hunt more successfully as opposed to in the bottom of these canyons. You have the Beelzebufo actually being displaced by the Rapitosaurs coming to wallow in the mud and then benefiting from it because of the giant holes and ponds they made. But for all of that great wealth of really wonderful sequences, there's some that are worse, like the baby pterosaurs getting off the swampy island and getting eaten by crocodilians. We saw that. It's literally a copy-paste of the Coasts episode when the baby pterosaurs leave the island and fly towards shore and get eaten by other adult pterosaurs. We've seen this. There's a reason that part was cut from the first season. We don't need as much baby murder, and there's a lot of baby murder in this season. And sometimes it just feels like gratuitous violence because they just put too much of it in. Again, it's kind of redundant when we've already seen so much of it. Let's see something a little more unique. Even the Hatzegopteryx mating scene. We've seen mating displays from many animals in this series. The Hatzegopteryx one doesn't really add anything that unique. It's unfortunate because the hunting sequence it had at the beginning of the episode was fantastic. But again, not adding anything new to the series. It's 5 minutes of kind of filler. If I'm being honest, it also seems like they could have just tied that on to the end of the first series' final part. Because the final part of the first series is when the Hatzegopteryx is hunting and then it goes out onto the beach and spreads its wings and flies out across the ocean on this prehistoric planet. And it's a really good sequence for ending the series on. It's just, again, it's very distinguished. It helps to show how broad these animals were, and it has the sense of majesty. Meanwhile, in season 2, we get Nanosaurus hunting, something we've already seen in the first season, and we've also seen a lot of Tyrannosaurs hunt in this season and the first season. For example, there's the Kingiaosaurus hunting Corythoraptor sequence in the first season that is probably one of the best shot and framed sequences in the entire series. Everything about it just has the right amount of tension. But because the Nonyxsaurus isn't hunting in a forest like the Kinshasa is, but is rather on a tundra, there's a lot more drone shots used, and that kind of ruins some of the tension. There's not that same sense of intimacy. There's not that same tension being built up. It's kind of a letdown for the end of the series. Now, other hunting sequences are done better. There's the Velociraptor one that I mentioned earlier, and also the Tyrannosaurus one, where they're hunting in the forest and doing some group hunting. I really do wish they had actually brought up some of the evidence for that. That's one place that I do think Prehistoric Planet is incredibly weak on. They just kind of go, yeah, this is what they did, without any real mention about why researchers think that that's possible, or why potentially they had that behavior. It's something I really wish they would have delved into more, especially on either the podcast, which I will mention again later, or in the subsequent little bonus videos about the production of it. There's only a few of them, and they really don't delve into the science as much as I would quite like. And on that production, I think there's definitely some other places that are kind of weak, especially in the Pachycephalosaurus bit of the Swamps episode. Because when you're looking at where they're filming, it's very clearly not a swamp, even a dry swamp like they try and argue it is. The trees you have are junipers and things that are more designed for dry environments. The Pachycephalosaurs even go into a dried creek bed that you can see very clearly at one time. Dried sandy creek beds aren't necessarily what you would expect from a swamp. So I think there's a little bit of issues there where they went, okay, well, we have this sequence that we need to put in somewhere. Where do we put it in? Just call it a dry swamp and throw it in the Swamps episode. We need something else to fill out that episode runtime. Again, I could be totally wrong, but that's just what it feels like to me. And if it's not, hopefully they'll be able to work on that in the future, trying to make the whole thing a little more cohesive in order to actually address some of these issues, which I think they could definitely do. And I am pretty certain there is probably a third season in the works, because they were talking on the official podcast of the show that they showed one of the showrunners at one point the Dinosauroid, where it's a humanoid dinosaur. And the person jokingly responded with, oh, we'll do that for Series 4, or Season 4 if you're in the United States, which implies there's already a Season 3 being worked on. So it'll be exciting to see if they can alleviate some of these issues, because while I did go on about them at length, they should all be pretty easy to address. And one of the things that I would really like to see is something a little closer to what we saw with Walking with Dinosaurs. And with that, I'm going to use the example of the first episode of Walking with Dinosaurs, where they show the dinosaur at the very beginning, but they're not really a major part of it for a large part of that episode, because instead we're looking at things like Lycosaurus, a mammal relative that's kind of the last holdings of the older Permian world before the mass extinction that killed off a lot of those animals and let the dinosaurs eventually rise to prominence. And the Lycosaurus almost immediately gets killed by a Postosuchus, a large crocodilian relative that were the dominant predators at the time. Meanwhile, Coelophysis, the smaller dinosaur, is just kind of running around snacking on what it can, including other closer mammal relatives. It's showing and setting up for dinosaur dominance, and then towards the end they really hammer that home by having the Postosuchus die and get eaten by the Coelophysis, and then showing a massive Plateosaurus for the things that are to come. It frames the entire Triassic in these little stories with the different characters. You're able to see how these dinosaurs were able to rise up through the Triassic and then become what they did. It frames the whole thing as a story much better. And I do admit and I do concede that it might be harder to do that in the style of Prehistoric Planet. It's just one of those things where I'm not as fond of that style of the documentary. I'd prefer it be more specific to each single place. That's why I really loved the Madagascar sequence. And so I'm really hoping Prehistoric Planet will try and do something like that. And that means they probably move out of the Maastrichtian the very, very end of the Cretaceous, like they did for the other 2 seasons of Prehistoric Planet. Because it's kind of hard to tell a story about general trends in the Maastrichtian unless it's they all died because a big rock from space came in. There's a lot of other really interesting stories and trends that we know of in the fossil record that we could show really well through some of these documentaries. I really hope they take that initiative and show us something a little bit new. Because the first 2 seasons were fantastic still. They just had some issues that I think could really easily be addressed.